Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We still have people joining, but it's a good idea to get a move on so that we have enough time to hear everything that that's going to be shared this afternoon. So I would like to welcome everybody to this webinar on leveraging private sector practices to guide green growth business environment reform, hosted by the Donor Committee on Enterprise Development, also known as DCED. And also in collaboration with DCED's Business Environment Working Group. So my name is Siobhan Kelly. I'm an agribusiness economist with the Food and Agricultural Organisation's Food Systems and Food Safety Division. I'll be your moderator for this afternoon session or your morning session, depending where you are in the world. You will have received a message on logging in that this session is being recorded, but just letting you know again. So the objectives of this afternoon's webinar is to present the finding of a report commissioned by the DCED on the title of the webinar, which I'll say again, leveraging private sector practices to guide green business environment reform. So the objective of the report, as you know, the climate crisis is intensifying and is the forefront to the work that all of us are doing. And the private sector is a critical actor in the solutions to the climate crisis. And so the DCED commissioned this report to examine why and how firms in their implementation of sustainability practices and green growth have successfully integrated climate and sustainability into their business models, and explore with that. The report explores with them how their experiences have evolved and the recommendations that they provide on policy analysis and reforms, providing guidance to policymakers and donors and international organizations and foundations on how to best support business environment reform and policy development for green growth. So the report covers a range of sectors, and in doing so provides a very nice cross-sectoral analysis on the types of policy reforms that can accelerate sustainability within green growth. And so the report will be shared online in the chat in case you haven't had an opportunity to download it, or you don't have the link. We will share it again, and hopefully you'll have an opportunity to read through the report. But in case you don't, the objective of this afternoon's webinar is to present the major findings from that report and the recommendations. The report was commissioned to the research organization Business for Social Responsibility, and we're very lucky to have Erin Lethiser, who will be representing BSR and was the lead behind the report. In addition, we will also be joined by Jesper Fano, and Jesper represents Maersk. So we'll have an opportunity to hear directly from the private sector about an example of the private sector's practices and experiences embedding green growth practices into their business model. Maybe a little bit on housekeeping. So Shortly, I will pass the floor to Erin, and she will provide us with the presentation of the report. Followed by that, then we'll have the presentation of Maersk Shipping and their insights, as I just alluded to. Followed by that, then we'll have a question and answer and discussion. So we'll have that for about 20 to 25 minutes. So a few of you have already sent in questions, so we can kick off with those questions. And we'll have a combination of questions. So it would be excellent if within the question and answer button that you'll see at the bottom of your screen, if you can use that box for your questions and answers. And then in the chat box, given that we all can't see who is with us in the room this afternoon, if you do want to use the chat box there to shout out and say where you're dialing in from and what organization you're representing, so we have an idea of who's in the room. And so following on from the question and answer discussion, so as I said, you can place your questions in the question and answer box, and we will use that to pull out some questions. But we would also like to hear from people in real time. So if you would like to share verbally your questions with us, then put your hands up. We'll most likely only have time for about 3 or 4 questions. So if you do have burning questions, make sure you get your hand up first using the raise hand button that you'll see down the bottom of the screen, which is in between share screen and record. Hopefully you're familiar with the Zoom technology by now. And then after the question and answer, then we'll have an outro, and I'll provide some summary conclusions, and we will finish promptly by 3:30. So with no further ado, then I would like to pass the floor to Erin to kick us off with today's webinar. With her presentation summarizing the findings from the report. Erin, over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Siobhan, and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. So my name is Erin Lighthizer. I'm an Associate Director with BSR's Nature and Climate Practice based out of our Copenhagen office. And as well, I'm also an Assistant Professor at Copenhagen Business School. On this project, I was joined by many tremendous colleagues from around BSR who are both here and of course named in the report. So very much a wonderful group effort to bring this to you today. So first, for those of you not familiar with BSR, we are a global nonprofit organization of sustainability experts. Our mission is to build a just and sustainable world, and we work with our more than 320 member companies, big companies from around the world, through providing insight and consulting and advice, but also by hosting collaborative initiatives, business roundtables and things to be able to tackle and work on various aspects of sustainability. We have offices worldwide and a variety of expertise in various areas of sustainability. So today, I'd like to give you an overview of the report and talk a little bit about first some of the motivations that we found of companies in about driving their own green performance and their transformation. And then a reflection and analysis on some of the business instruments that they saw as most influential in this process. We also had some great findings around kind of the role of different actors in business environment reform for green growth. So we'll tease out and talk about that a little bit, and then round out with some of the overall recommendations following the findings of the study. As Siobhan said, please do start chatting in the Q&A box, any questions you have along the way. But before I dive in, I think to underscore the importance and the relevance and timeliness of this topic, I ran across a study commissioned by Google just earlier this year amongst senior executives at organizations, at businesses around the world, asking them about their plans for sustainability and making a green transition in their own companies, and found out very much they are ready and willing to do this. Part of the study was asking about what are the barriers to achieving this. And as you can see in the bottom right, one of the top barriers that they mentioned is a lack of regulatory incentives or disincentives. So it really does underscore the importance of the business environment in helping shape and facilitate a green transition. Now, to jump into the role or the overview of the report itself. So for those of you who haven't had a look yet, you can kind of get a very quick overview of what you'll find there. So we have the introduction, which gives a bit of the background of the study, and outlines the organizations that we interviewed and used as principal points of the study. We look a bit at their history of their efforts on sustainability, what were their motivations, how have they gotten where they are, and in particular, what is the role of public instruments in business environment. Then it goes on to analyze some of the instruments that they found as the most influential there, and I'll go into a bit more detail in a moment. And then, as I said before, we kind of tease out and talk a bit about the role of the business environment in influencing and facilitating green growth, and then make some recommendations for how this might be approached in the future. So first, one of the questions that we asked was, what are their motivations driving green performance? And in some ways, it would have been lovely if they had said, there's this one business environment instrument, this one regulatory initiative that absolutely shaped our view and our work. But the companies we chose to look at the study are certainly of the more progressive ones, who are much more, kind of leaders in their pack, in their industry, in their geography, on green growth practices. So perhaps given that, unsurprisingly, it wasn't so much the regulatory environment that drove them to undertake more sustainable business practices, but really pressure from a variety of stakeholders, whether that be demands from their consumers who want greener products or to purchase from greener companies. It might be investors worrying about their business, some on reputation, and a lot about ensuring a resilient and long-term business that will be able to operate and succeed in an environment that, in a climate environment that is continually changing and presents challenges in many different ways. So by looking at this, I think we can see how their motivations then kind of help shape some of their behaviors. And as part of this, we did ask a lot of questions around what are the business environments, instruments that really shaped what you did? Did it help? Did it hinder? And how might these translate for other companies, perhaps ones that aren't quite as far along on their journey? And in looking at this, companies really flagged kind of 5 types of instruments, which I'll give a bit of an overview here. So then we did, of course, a lot of desk research to kind of analyze and put together with our primary data to understand, what are the advantages and how can these help? But also conversely, what are some of the limitations of these instruments as well? So the first is carbon price. We know that this can be a very powerful incentive for companies to lower their emissions, to overall promote green growth over time. And in a sense of kind of social fairness, it creates a greater social efficiency because those who are producing the pollution are the ones who are paying for this. And as part of that, I think particularly many of the companies we talked to saw this as a very powerful tool for being able to generate funds to help support other aspects of the green transition, such as the necessary research and development to be able to get us there. However, of course, there's limitations with this as well. Carbon leakage, when we have jurisdictionally set markets, currently the prices are far too low to be able to really have any sort of meaningful impact on behavior. And we know that small businesses, businesses in developing environments may really require some specialized support to help them make the transition so that they're not disadvantaged by a carbon price. The second instrument that they identified was the use of tax credits and subsidies. So we heard a lot about how this helps de-risk investments, I think in many ways, because it helps to signal that there's a priority amongst regulators and donors and development agencies that indeed this is the way to go. So not only makes it more financially feasible, but also de-risks it overall as a general, that sort of direction as a strategy for their companies. So it makes it good business. And then overall can really help green the overall marketplace. However, tax credits and subsidies, I think, should be seen more as a stick than a carrot. So they do very little to curb or disincentivize poor behaviors. Sometimes these can create kind of long-term dependence or create other disincentives to further innovation. But can be a powerful tool when used in the right way. Then the third was research and development. I think general understanding and agreement that we need more research and development to get where we're going to go. Biofuels are not, where we need them to be yet. Renewable energy needs to be further developed and scaled, right? That we need to put more investment into these to come up with the right solutions and to scale those solutions. Of course, we don't want this to be completely dependent on project or public funding, but it does help. We know that the needle needs to move, and this is one way to do it. The fourth was the role of infrastructure. So perhaps less of an instrument and more of an investment area. But this is often a precondition to being able to make the transition. So we heard stories about, wanting to purchase, 30% of a company's energy mix as renewable energy, but there simply isn't the renewable energy available in their market to do this. So we see, quite clearly how the infrastructure then can relate to what is business actually able to achieve and do. And then finally, what we are calling targeted regulations. So those that mandate or look at very specific aspects of sustainability. So these could be things like bag bans, or changes to the composition of fossil fuels, certain kinds of pollution reduction technologies, right? This can be very effective in very targeted ways for specific issues. So looking at all of this, I think we found some really interesting things about understanding and reflecting on what is the role of the business environment in facilitating green growth. So one of the first points, I think, was really looking at how businesses really kind of view their role vis-a-vis the role of policymakers in green growth. So, I think as we can pick these apart, it helps us to really identify what are the synergies and how can they work together and each kind of play their own role to be able to push forward and accelerate a green transition. So first, I think companies really saw the role of policymakers and regulators as their job is to really raise the floor, not the ceiling. Great if they can raise the ceiling, but business is also very good at do that, right? Business is good at pushing the boundaries and pushing limits. But what they're not able to do is make everyone play on the same playing field. So there's a lot of talk about ensuring there are minimum standards across the board, because it's hard to compete when you are a company who's trying to be more sustainable and making huge investments with someone else who isn't, even you're in the same sector. So having minimum standards and raising that floor is a really key critical area for policymakers to focus on. This then levels the playing field in the marketplace so that those who are making investments and are making a green transition aren't disadvantaged because of that. And when everyone's subject to the same expectations and has to play by the same rules, it can really help accelerate green growth, both by bringing everyone up, but then it goes into this, what we call the ambition loop. So by raising the minimum standards and raising levels of ambition, you create this sort of natural, healthy competition to, kind of the race to net zero emissions. So that can be a very powerful motivator as well. So then when we flip and think about the role of businesses, many businesses have very long, complex, and deep supply chains, particularly in many ODA, overseas development countries. And so with this, they already are working with their suppliers on any number of issues. It could be on product innovation or quality, but increasingly this is also working on climate goals. So as companies are setting scope 3 goals, so this is everything kind of outside their business operations and energy usage, they have to bring their suppliers along if they're going to make progress on this. And so as we think about this is, from maybe a policymaker perspective, these large corporations with long supply chains actually, I think, present a really interesting opportunity for how policymakers can engage with them and be able to use their kind of networks and knowledge and business processes to help green the overall marketplace through the reach of their supply chain. We also know that in the absence of strong public regulation, as is the case in many of the environments where companies source materials and products from, that given that there aren't such strong standards, that the private sector has adopted a lot of voluntary standards and targets. We see this through, for example, SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, right, that they're using a kind of private initiative to be able to set net zero goals and push those forwards with their suppliers. And so they're also pushing their suppliers to do these things too. So an interesting way to think about, I think, the role of business vis-a-vis policymakers. And then we can also think about some of the activities as well in the business environment and how this relates to green growth. So I think one of the things we were hoping to find is being able to isolate and identify, a certain few policies or suite of policies that were kind of the silver bullet, and that mix would reach and really be able to push forward green growth. I think what we found instead was that it really is this overall overarching policy mix. It's not just one or two things. It's not just tax credits and carbon price and then you're set, but it's really about utilizing a variety of instruments in different ways and in complementary ways to be able to create a holistic approach to sustainability. Policies should both use sticks and carrots, discourage bad behavior while encouraging good behavior. You need a mix of both. And that these, of course, need to be complementary and mutually reinforcing. So, for example, we heard a lot about how fossil fuel subsidies, work in opposition to renewable energy development, right? So we can see that these are already not working in very congruent ways for a green transition. The next is to think about and consider unintended consequences. So I know this is a really difficult one, but thinking about some of the unintended or knock-on effects of policy changes. These are really tough to anticipate, but when done well, if we can take lessons from one environment, there's the potential that we can take lessons learned and things that may have taken a while, particularly in the global north, to be able to develop. How do we take those lessons and create an informed view that can then be translated as appropriate, contextually appropriate in various environments in the global south, and therefore kind of leapfrog some of these investments in these countries and really push them on a very accelerated track. And finally, I think on that note of thinking about the green transition as a development opportunity. So how can development projects focus on the needs of a green transition and really focus funds and efforts on being able to push forward those sorts of projects and activities. And it's also worth noting many of the companies saw very distinct opportunities for green growth in the global south. Biofuels, for example, is really going to change how and where fuel sources are, where they come from, where they're procured from. And so are there ways that certain environments might be able to be positioned in a way to help support green growth and really benefit from the economic aspects of the green transition. So another very critical thing for the business environment to consider. So finally, probably the most exciting part is what are the recommendations then that come forth from all of this? So we have three kind of overarching recommendations with various sub recommendations. So the first is that to create a clear and a consistent regulatory environment. Businesses really like predictable, consistent markets, the specification of minimum standards, understanding what the rules of the game are. And business is fabulous at innovating and figuring out how to work within various parameters and things. So I think ensuring that you have consistency over time is very important. So, for example, one of the examples came up of it can be really difficult when perhaps a certain technology is mandated that it needs to be implemented on, say, ship scrubbers or in a manufacturing plant for air pollution control. Because then if that technology is changed or mandated to move to a different technology, a few years later, there's a real sunk cost investment by business. So, perhaps policymakers can then think about more around how might they legislate around outcomes and think about how do you push outcomes and then allow businesses to understand how to be able to navigate the environment and the tools and resources to be able to meet those outcomes. Part of this, as I discussed before, is really thinking about increasing raising the floor on minimum standards so that you create that level playing field across the board. And as well, in so much as it's possible to globally align standards, because this makes it so much easier for business to be able to operate, that a product that is allowed to be sold in one market is also available in another market. That if they're collecting sustainability data for reporting purposes, that they can use it and analyze it and report it in the same way in both a North American and a European environment. So in so much as it's possible, I think it's really helpful when policymakers can align standards so that they are consistent across jurisdictions and across markets. The second area of recommendations is around creating an ecosystem of green growth. Ensuring, I think, alignment about what is mandated and what is possible. And that means, I think, making investments in these same ways. So back to the example I gave earlier, it's difficult to mandate that companies get 50% of their power needs met through renewable energy if that amount of renewable energy isn't available on the market. So really thinking through how do the investments made on the ground then facilitate and complement the mandates that are being made of business. Then there's also aligning, so this is aligning business practices with investments and ensuring that these are congruent with each other. And then last, I think, is thinking really holistically about what are the outcomes that we need to see, and what does this mean more broadly? So with renewable energy, to scale renewable energy, it means that we need to look at several different national business systems. So do the legal system, do laws need to be updated that around mandates or taxes levied around different energy uses and energy mix? Is there a workforce that is trained and capable and able of manufacturing and providing and servicing various renewable energy technologies? So as we start walking this back, we can think through a lot of the implications of making the green transition are more than just focused on business, but really touch a lot of various aspects of society. So as we're investing in education programs and development projects, how do these then ladder up and support and facilitate the broader needs of a green transition? And then finally, the recommendation to target business environment reform into high impact areas for green growth. So carbon pricing, we know, can be a powerful motivator, but this of course needs to then be complemented by the sunsetting of contradictory policies like fossil fuel subsidies, which obviously work in opposition to each other. Many companies, and I think a lot of research would point to the importance of mandated climate disclosure and keeping companies moving along. The old adage is absolutely true: what gets measured gets managed. So by mandating climate disclosure and reporting, companies then have to report on this. And so it helps them not only start measuring that and understanding where they are, but then to be able to make progress, because then you have a data point to be able to work against. That said, I think all of the companies too would say that meeting mandated reporting requirements is a journey and can sometimes be a real challenge. And so when approaching mandated disclosure, to really think about it as maybe a staged kind of process of the requirements in year one might be quite low and easy. And this gradually builds in year 2, year 3, et cetera, over time, to also then reflect the maturity of the company to be able to identify and track that sort of data and metrics. And finally, investment in research and development, we know is critical to making progress in many areas. This could be renewable energy, power grid, distribution technology, battery technology, biofuels, right? We have lots of examples of areas where the solutions are kind of nascent, so either aren't there yet or aren't scalable or affordable. So these are some areas where investments in projects could really be useful in facilitating and accelerating a green transition. So with that, I will say thank you. I will pass back to Siobhan, and we'll be happy to answer your questions a little bit later in the webinar. Thank you.
Erin, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. And you really did an excellent job of synthesizing and also bringing to the fore the main findings from this report. And yeah, just your comment on this concept of race to net zero emissions is, I think, so important for us, so that we're all moving in the same direction. For instance, the sector that I work in, the agri-food system, obviously this is such an important concept for us to be able to work with countries on. And also the idea that you underscored on raising the floor and the minimum standards. Again, in the agri-food system, FAO hosts Codex Alimentarius, which does exactly that. It creates that minimum floor standard for countries to identify as a benchmark with, and where policymakers and the private sector come together to raise standards in food safety. So who knows? Maybe that concept could be transferred to the area of sustainability, whilst obviously complex, possibly doable. Okay, so I'd now like to introduce Jasper Fano. Jasper is joining us from Moller Maersk, and Jasper is a senior regulatory affairs manager and public affairs with the company. So Jasper, can you introduce yourself? And just to say that, Jasper, we're not going to have a formal presentation again, but more of a conversation, no, to hear about Jasper's insights on this area that he follows at Maersk. Jasper.
Thank you very much, Siobhan, and thank you very much for having me for this great event. Well, a couple of words on myself. I've been working with Maersk since 2017. Before that, I have a history of working for both the Maritime Authority in Denmark, but also the Environmental Protection Agency in Denmark. And here at Maersk, I work primarily with emissions regulations regarding first sulfur, but since that regulation was adopted and entered into force 1st of January 2020, the main focus has been on decarbonisation. And perhaps I should mention, part-time I teach international law at Copenhagen University and has done so for 10 years. And that's also an interesting and important aspect when we talk about UN legislation and the policies that we're going to get into now, because the enforcement of it embedded in the international law scene is also important to keep in mind.
Jasper, thanks very much for that intro. Okay, so Erin's presentation alluded to some of the types of initiatives, that Maersk is taking forward to address green growth in its operations. So with respect to the company that you work for, can you firstly expand on some of the more the initiatives with respect to environmental and social goals of these initiatives that you find exciting? And secondly, talk about the role that you see government policy playing in enabling these practices or disabling them?
Or disabling, yeah. Of course, I'll be happy to. Well, regarding the first part of your question, I'll be happy to provide a couple of examples. One example on the environmental part and one example on more of the social aspects of it. First of all, regarding the environmental aspects, which in this case allowed to include climate goals. The IMO, the International Maritime Organization, and the UN's, what you say, Maritime Organization, had commissioned some studies throughout the late 90s and early 2000s depicting how the greenhouse gas emissions was from international shipping. And it became clear that international shipping has a huge greenhouse gas footprint. The last study actually upped the final calculation, you could say, to being 3% of all greenhouse gas emissions globally are derived from maritime shipping. So it was clear that something needed to be done. And negotiations started at the IMO, but within Maersk, we could clearly see that there was a need to move forward and press the industry through being a first runner, or first mover, you could say, by setting some goals. So in 2018, even though we didn't really have the final solution to how we should solve it, we decided to say we want to become net zero carbon neutral by 2050. And then everything started moving really fast, you could say, because we started investigating, teaming up with researchers, et cetera, and it turned out that we believe that methanol is the way to go for us. I know that some are also thinking ammonia, which we haven't ruled out, but at this point we foresee major challenges with the handling of ammonia, the safety aspects, et cetera, things that we don't see when using methanol. So pretty clear we zoomed in on methanol, and that became our go-to fuel in the future, we believe. We started by commissioning a small vessel back in 2021, but immediately the year after we took the leap and ordered all in all 12 vessels, big container vessels, sailing on methanol to be delivered in I believe it was 2024 and 2025. So and that led to another aspect of it, because even though the technology was kind of being developed on, at least on what you would say, the drawing table, there was the aspect of fuel. Who would then provide the fuel, because the fuel isn't available, especially in those quantities that would be needed. So it's a chicken or egg situation. But we decided to go all in and believe that if we were industry first mover, we could push the rest to follow, and therefore also incentivizing the fuel suppliers to take up the need to produce the fuel, basically. And where we are today is that we have actually seen a shift within the market, within the industry, not just the shipping side, where we have now other carriers moving towards methanol also, but also within the fuel supplier side, that they can see the business case, that this is for real, and they can start taking the associated risks with investments for starting to produce those methanol fuels. So we have also, what should we say, put our neck out regarding entering into certain collaborations with fuel producers to ensure that we are also for real in this. So, and that was just really on the environmental part. On the social part, I would like to mention another example within our company, and that is regarding ship recycling. Now, ship recycling has many years had a bad reputation, you could say, and rightfully so, because there's been these tremendous stories, heinous stories of how ships were recycled in some parts of the world under horrible conditions. But the thing is, the ships need to be recycled. They have a certain life expectancy, and at some point they get obsolete. And that is only going to increase in the coming years because of the decarbonisation agenda, and we need more and newer efficient ships. And basically, we also need to use yards outside of Europe, because they can best handle recycling the larger vessels. But what we did from Maersk sides to incorporate the social aspects and to try and heighten everything was that we first of all decided to develop our own standard. There wasn't really, there are certain regulations on an EU level for ship recycling, and there are also some adopted at IMO level, the Hong Kong Convention, but that hasn't entered into force yet. And even though there's some EU regulation, it's very much regarding the recycling itself, the environmental part. What we said, we can't just focus on the environmental part. We also need to ensure worker safety, labor conditions, hospital care, and basically just all of the elements that also go into to having a sound recycling environment. So we developed our own standard and put it into our own recycling program, aligned with or entered into agreements with 12 yards in the Lang area. And now we have this way of recycling ships where we look at environmental aspects, work safety aspects, and working conditions in general, health safety, labor conditions, anti-corruption, working environment, and also bettering the wider area around the yards with hospital care, etc., etc. So also taking the social responsibility, because we feel it's the right thing to do. And we had huge capex costs associated, because we don't own the 12 yards, we just work with them, but we took the costs for establishing many of the things that they needed, the huge crane, the embedded sea floor, the mobile hospital care unit, and those are things that are now given to the yards. Even when they do not recycle Maersk vessels, but other vessels, they're still able to utilize the things that we paid for, because we're now working together with them in those aspects. So yeah, that was a couple of examples of the environmental/social aspects. Now, regarding the second part of your question, Siobhan, regarding the role that government policies plays in all of this. Well, first of all, it's important that policy, and when I use the term policy, it also covers regulations, that we have some sort of minimum standard, a minimum, what should we say, common ground that every company should follow. Also to create a level playing field for companies, because even though some companies, for instance, Maersk within the maritime sector, wants to be first movers and take on the associated costs and risks that go along, it is important that what should we say, that the minimum level of how competitors and other companies need to operate under is raised to the highest extent possible, which is also stated in the report. So having a good minimum standard is important, and that's, I know what they're working on right now at the IMO. They have a target that they have agreed on, but how they're going to do it, the regulatory measures for instance, decarbonisation, have not yet been adopted. But we are trying to work with authorities and organizations to push it to the levels or the regulatory measures to be as good as possible, you could say. So you could both look at it, and I know the report also does so, from a positive and a negative angle when it comes to government policy. So when it comes to the positive aspects, incentivization definitely needed in many aspects, and also, you know, the enforcement has to be in place. When it comes to the negative side, and Aaron alluded to it, there has to be consistency. So once the policymakers adopt something, for instance, a measure, the scrubbers were mentioned, and I'm not going to bore the audience with what a scrubber is, but just in short, it's a technology you put on the top of the stack or when you say the chimney of a ship, and then it washes the smoke that comes out, and then the water from it is put out into the sea. And that was a technology that was hyped by the IMO back in the 2000s, and said, you need to change to this. It will have good operational costs. It will be beneficial for the environment, etc., etc. In recent years, discussions have started whether or not the scrubber system as such is a good technology. Now, we are not against looking into whether or not an existing technology is bad or good. By all means, we should continuously try to move the bar to the furthest extent possible. But what we're saying is, do not punish first movers. if a technology proves to be has challenges associated, then you should phase it out. For instance, first of all, stopping new builds, but secondly, existing technologies should be phased out easily, because otherwise, if you just from one day to another say this is now obsolete, this is now illegal, then the huge capex costs associated with it in the first place will then go lost. And basically what it does is it will discourage other companies from being first movers. And now we're talking software, but let's also look at the climate, because some technologies are also being discussed in that regard. But no one is going to be a first mover for a new technology that is still a bit unproven if they have seen previous examples of first movers being penalized in that way. So everything has to kind of tie in together, you could say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. Some really fascinating insights there, Jesper. And yet the first mover, the competitive advantage, and also the risks associated being an industry leader in sustainability and the business case. Also how environmental and social standards, it's very difficult to separate those, that they really, when we speak about sustainability, it's a package, isn't it? It's often synonymous with environment, but rather it's a package, and that's something as well in the agri-food system that we're definitely seeing. I would even put another pillar on there, the nutrition side for that. So, okay, so then, right, so you've spoken a lot about these, the policy enabling environment and the policy pressures for green growth, and it's an important driver there. But obviously, the private sector and your company needs to respond to clients, you need to respond to investors as well. And so I imagine there's tensions there between those three stakeholder groups. So can you speak a bit about those tensions, please, and tell us how a company might manage them and what the issues are?
Yeah, of course, I'll be happy to. First of all, I would say when it comes to the customers and investor relations, there is of course, there can be tensions, but there are also certain overlaps, because what we see, and that was also the reason why our decarbonization, because we're not just an altruistic company, we're also, a company in the essence that we have to make things work, and we have customers and everything. So the reason why we also started our decarbonization agenda is because we felt a clear need to push in the right direction, following how we see the trends among our customers and investors, that they are also becoming more and more aware of who are we, for instance, investing in, what is the company's profile in terms of being green, and what are they doing to better the climate, environment, and also social conditions, the whole ESG agenda. But also on a customer level, we have customers that are asking us, because we also provide certain products today where they pay a premium to have their containers shipped on fuels that emit less CO2. That's so-called advanced biofuels, not biofuels derived from feedstocks from what you say, grain or anything like that, but advanced biofuels incentivized, for instance, by the Dutch government. They pay a premium, and that allows us to supply these services, and there's a huge demand for it. That was my point. Customers, a huge demand for those solutions, and the investors. Well, they look by investors. I'm also talking about the rating agencies that look at these publicly noted companies, and they scrutinize us really well down to the details of, okay, how is their ESG agenda? Who are not just what are they doing themselves. For instance, here at Maersk, we have internal procedures on whistleblowing, diversity, and ombudsman, et cetera, but also who are we associated with? What industry organizations are we a part of? Because if they're not green enough, then that also reflects poorly on us. So even if it's not us per se, we can still be penalized by the investors for just, hanging around with the wrong crowd, you could say. So yeah, and that's definitely the way we're seeing it. That's the way the winds are blowing.
Okay, great, fascinating. Yeah, be careful. Be careful who you hang out with.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so lastly then, looking to Maersk's future aspirations for green growth with respect to regulations for the industry, and those expected to be adopted in the coming years on greenhouse gas reductions, what are the challenges that you foresee in this space?
Well, first of all, the first challenge is having the regulation adopted, because it's at the IMO, it's consensus driven, and even though they have these targets that they have already set, finding out how to meet them, that is challenging, and everyone has to agree. And that, of course, in itself is the first challenge, you could say, having the right regulation adopted that suits and actually meets the needed requirements. Sometimes when I teach the students, ask me if I feel that the UN system as such is too, what should we say, heavy in terms of reaching agreements, because compared to, for instance, the EU, where you have given power to many of the entities, the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council, they just adopt things without really necessarily having an individual states approve it. My point and my comment to the students always are no, because there's also merit to the UN system, because even though the process might sometimes take some time, the outcome is that we all agree on it. So the conventions, the finalized treaties, what we end up with are a product of something that all states can see themselves in, more or less, and that everyone has agreed on. And that's the power, that's the very meaningful power of the UN system when it comes to those kind of conventions and adoptions of treaties. So I have a huge faith in that they'll definitely get there regarding the first part. But that's the first challenge, you could say, getting there. The second part is then the enforcement. And what I mean by that is within the UN system, we have these opportunities for, as I mentioned, creating, adopting treaties, for instance, on climate. But when it comes to, at the end of the day, once the treaty is signed and has entered into force, what happens then? What if someone violates it? That's very much based on an individual state level for them to enforce. And first of all, we need to ensure that all states are equally keen on enforcing what they have actually signed up to. And secondly, we also have to ensure that the conventions adopted with the material, for instance, regulations on maritime matters, fit with the more overall, what we say, broadly framed regulatory conventions, also within the UN system, the framework conventions, you could say, that set out some limits. For instance, within the maritime field, we have the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which sets some jurisdictional boundaries, but also provides possibilities for states to enforce maritime legislation, for instance, on climate. So we have to, I mentioned briefly the sulfur regulation, which entered into force 1st of January 2020, and I won't go into the details of it, but there was actually quite a lot of concern and talks leading up to that date of the entry into force on whether or not it could actually be effectively enforced due to UNCLOS. Fortunately, everything fell into place, but my point is you have to think of it holistically, so that that all of those framework conventions that set the scene and boundaries and frames also fit in. And finally, I would also highlight that this is not a challenge, but I foresee as a possible solution within the UN system. I'm a huge fan of the International Law Commission's work, and many of the things that they have on their agenda. I know that they're looking at the protection of the atmosphere and measures against rising sea levels. That's going to be immensely important, because that is also going to be an aspect within the UN system on how to address this, and also get states to follow suit. And especially regarding state responsibility, meaning there's a convention on this with some articles, and having that also encompass this, so that if a state signs up for an international agreement and doesn't live up to it, then they can be dragged before the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and actually be held accountable for not living up to what they signed up for in the first place. So I feel that the IOC's work on this is immensely important. Also, to my mind, I won't go into the details, but developing principles of use Kokens to encompass climate questions will also be a way to go. Thank you.
Jasper, excellent. Immense thanks for that. Yeah, it's really important that we balance out when we are researching and advocating and identifying these lessons to share with policymakers, that we also balance it out with research as well, and on that action needed to support their implementation. No, they're often kind of espoused and communicated in a way that maybe doesn't allow for the practical application or the challenges of their application. And so it's so important, because otherwise we're not going to move forward, no, if they're not implementable. Okay, so let's turn it over then to a broader conversation between Aaron. Also, Aaron, if you can come back on, and so all of you guys, all listeners, if you can kind of start putting your questions, please, in the question box. I think we've had a couple in the chat box, and I think Aaron's been busy answering a couple of those. And also, as I said at the beginning, if there are any people that would like to share verbally, then we can activate your mic if you can put your hand up. So we'll only have about, I think, time for 3 or 4 hands maximum. But in the meantime, while you're thinking about your questions, we did actually have some questions that already came in while people were registering. And so, I'll go to that second question there on demonstrating the business case for private sector investment in green practices. So, Eric, you alluded to it in your response. Well, alluded, I think you spoke very, pertinently and punctually about the business case, speaking about this, the competitive advantage as well in being the first mover, but also the risks associated in those front-ending those costs. So Aaron, maybe I can pass the floor to you to, in the experience that you have engaging with the BSR network and the companies in the network, how you see the business case here for investment in sustainability and green growth.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think many years ago we used to think about the business case as being, you put $1 in, you get $2 out, right? But I don't think that's the case anymore. I think this is the very kind of instrumental way of looking at it. And if you can build that business case, then great. But I think in our experience and through the various company members that we work with, I think really understanding the imperative of making these changes for their business for a variety of reasons. So this might be, I think as Jesper spoke about, response to demands from customers who want greener products and services. It might be investors who, are concerned about the long-term health and direction of the company. And even more fundamental, particularly for, I think, a lot of food, bev, and ag companies, but even beyond that to consumer sectors and others, that the changes to the climate are causing real risks and disruptions to their supply chains. What happens if they're no longer able to access, even at an affordable cost, the kind of ingredients and materials that are critical to their business and the products that they have? So I think many are seeing a real need to evolve their business, both I think to ensure the integrity of their business models and the products and services that they deliver, but also then the long-term health and resilience and ability of their company to survive and what is going to be a drastically changing climactic environment. I mean, we know even with drastic action, things are going to get worse before they get better. And so I think companies are finally starting to prepare for this. Perhaps the other note too on this that is maybe less related to the business case, but I think there's been a lot of regulatory activity around this, as there certainly should be and needs to be. And I think particularly companies on the forefront are very interested in being proactive about this, of what are the disclosure requirements going to be. For example, there's a new regulation being debated in the EU about the origin of forest products and proving that they have traceability, that they haven't contributed to deforestation. So I think really wanting to be on the forefront of these sorts of regulatory and legislative developments, so that if and when they do come into place, compliance is easy, right? They're already in compliance with it. They're out front and already ahead. So I think lots of different reasons.
Excellent. Thanks, Erin. And Jesper, do you have any more thoughts on that?
Fully agree with what Erin said. I perhaps have an example from what you would say in real life for that a business case can be developed through private actors joining forces and actually pushing a certain part of the industry to focus more on the climate aspects. Maersk and some other liners went and joined something called the Poseidon Principles, where they joined forces with different banks and insurers working within the maritime industry, basically banks lending money to build new ships and the insurance companies insuring them. Sorry, and they started to say, you're not just to focus on the economical business cases, but now it's also on the climate impact. Those new ships that are being built, what are their climate footprints? Meaning, the higher the footprint, the higher the rate at which they could borrow, even if they are barred from borrowing. And in return, the more climate friendly the ships are, the cheaper it is to borrow money, and that's the train of thought where you start to take this very normal normally very economically classical focused aspect of lending and borrowing within companies, and suddenly turn it into also a green aspect and have that kind of influence the whole discussion, you would say.
Yeah, completely. I agree. And I think there is also an economic component to sustainability and from the efficiency side of things. Like I remember once visiting a meat factory and talking to them about their sustainability strategy, and they were approached, actually they'd been approached by the government to join in a sustainability program. And they looked at it and they said, you know what, this is about cost savings and we're going to call it our sustainability program, because it's about reducing costs related to energy, related to water, and to a myriad of wastage also. And so it became a very important part of reducing their costs, and that's sometimes an aspect of sustainability. It's often seen by many companies as a cost, as a burden. But there's definitely, as we're seeing, a big business case and big opportunities in this area for companies. Okay, so anybody online like to take the floor and ask a question? I'm just wondering as well if any of the task team who generously participated in supporting this study would also like to add. I see some of them online. I'm not sure if they're open to kind of adding a comment or also asking a question based on what we've heard. Okay, anyway, what we can do is we can go back to the questions already received so far. So there was a question also about the private sector working with smallholder farmers in the green economy, and any examples that we can provide in that respect. There were a couple of cases, or there are a couple of cases in the report that that belong, a couple of companies that belong to the agri-food sector, and so there are some examples provided there. They don't necessarily go specifically into the role of smallholders within the green economy. Before, I pass on, if Aaron maybe has any thoughts on that, but just to say from the FAO side that there are and a lot of initiatives that FAO promotes and works with national stakeholders on. For instance, we have conservation agriculture, the work that FAO does on agroecology, and also on integrated pest management. And there is really working with institutions and NGOs and local government and those actors that work within with production systems and with smallholders, and developing approaches that are greener and that support farmers to be greener and how they carry out their production activities. And but then there is always that challenge in how those practices that are invested in then are recompensated by the market, and how those the produce emanating from those farms that have adopted these practices are branded and the return on investment seen, so that they can be upscaled. And also just linked to that, we FAO held an event yesterday with Tufts on true cost accounting. So there is a recording on that if anybody's interested in it, but that really looks at how we can revert to the real return on investment in terms of food. Obviously a very difficult topic, particularly for policymakers within this high inflation era, but something that's very much tied to today's conversation. So, Erin, is there anything that you, in terms of your experience again with the members in BSR, that you've had in terms of that linkage between smallholders and the private sector in the green growth space?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of a perfect question in the sense I do a lot of work with helping large corporates work particularly with their smallholder suppliers. So it may not be farmers and maybe not be Africa specific, but I think there's some broader kind of lessons that can be translated across environments. So one, I think, is to I think understand the context and the challenges that the smallholders face. So we know the number one reason that small and medium-sized businesses don't take climate action is they don't know what to do, right? It's hard to know, and you don't have those skills, you don't have that capacity, you can't hire on an expert to run sustainability if you're a 5-person organization or a 10-person farm. That just isn't possible. So I think one of the things that we see a lot, particularly with companies who are really able to make progress on things like their Scope 3 emissions and changes in their supply chains, are those who really, I think, try to reach out and understand what are the challenges faced by their various small suppliers, and what is the context that they're operating in, and then how can you craft a solution that's appropriate both for their challenges as well as for their context. So we had there's a great example, I think, in the report from CP Foods, which is a food conglomerate based out of Thailand, who was having a lot of challenges on their Scope 3 goals, and asking farmers to reduce emissions. But of course, that's a very challenging ask when you don't know what to do. And so one of the things they did is kind of go and analyze, where are the emissions coming from at the farms? What are the problems that are existing? And then realized they could help facilitate some very low cost investment in methane recollection systems on, for example, on cattle farms and pig farms, that then can be used that both lowers emissions, but then contributes to energy development to production on site. So it is both helpful for the farmers themselves, right? They have some cleaner operations and to be able to work with. But then also helps the overall CP group as well meet some of their scope 3 goals. I think maybe a couple of the other kind of broader lessons as well to think about with companies working with smallholders in their supply chain, I think is thinking about it as holistically as possible. So the impacts of the company sourcing don't end at the factory door or at the end of the farm field, right? But these carry through to, what are the wages that are paid to their families? What are the working conditions, or not to families, to the workers to then be able to support their families? What are working conditions? What are the impacts on nature of those agricultural operations? And how does that impact the environment around these communities and affect these communities? If you're contributing to deforestation and land use change, you're probably also contributing to changes in the microclimate and precipitation patterns, which then can lead to flooding or drought or other kind of imbalances in the environment that have larger, broader effects throughout the community. So I think really thinking through what are the operations that are within the supply chain that impact not just the workers in direct operations, but really those whole communities. And these landscapes around that, because kind of as we've alluded to or talked about before, if companies want to have continued access to all of the materials and commodities and things that they need, we do need to take this holistic perspective to think about the environment, to think about society and communities broadly as well.
Okay, thank you, Erin, for those insights. Yeah, and drawing our attention to that part of the report that CP contributed to. And yeah, I'd just like to take up the, I knew I did see a question in the chat there. I've just located it from Daniel. I'm not sure where Daniel hails from, but okay, so his question is, yeah, about countries. Are there, in the experiences that you've had, are there any countries that kind of stand out in terms of where they are on this spectrum? Countries, I'm going to add my own interpretation here. But yeah, maybe countries like policy settings that are progressive, that are supportive, that are working with the private sector, that are very much engaged in conversations with the private sector, so that there is alignment there, and that the two sectors are moving forward together. Are there any countries by any chance that kind of stand out that you think are worth putting on the radar?
I think that's a tough one to answer. I think because in this study we didn't do a kind of specific country by country approach or analysis.
Yeah, just generally.
Yeah, so maybe some broad reflections. I think we've seen a lot of movement in the EU, thinking about the EU market and how that can help shape not just activities and operations within the EU, but more broadly and somewhat indirectly supply chains globally. So the impending carbon market legislation is really designed to prevent leakage. So this is what happens, right? If carbon is priced or mandated in one market, production simply moves to another market where it's not mandated, which is a problem. So the EU legislation will then levy a carbon tax at the border. So that way anything coming into the union will then be, be put on the same footing again. So not disadvantaging those who have been produced with lower emissions methods, perhaps in markets that then end up being a little bit more expensive. I think that's one. Yeah, for better or for worse, I think we've seen a lot of progressive policies in Rwanda. I think one of the first African countries to institute a a plastic bag ban. They have a lot of focus on environmental and community development from an environmental focus, safeguarding certain parts of the forest and areas there. So again, there's some challenges with some of those policies and how they work, but I think we've seen at least some of them be on a more progressive side. But Jesper, I don't know if you have any experience from Maersk of particularly helpful environments.
No, yes, of course, we have examples of many different countries and jurisdictions being helpful within different areas, but I must say that not some in particular spring to mind. It's more along the lines of certain countries having a special focus on something, and then they kind of follow through on that. So yeah, looking on a global scale, as you mentioned, in Europe, they're making different also legislative approaches at the moment with the Fit for 55 package, which also is gonna really hit the maritime sector. But also looking outside the EU, there are many different environmental, also national, what should we say, regulations where they kind of say, okay, this is where we're going to focus on here. I know that, for instance, in the US, the state of California is very progressive. I know that China also has certain aspects with when ships call upon Chinese ports that they focus on. So, so I would say that in general, countries are moving in the right direction, and the thing is, to put it more broadly, that, and I won't go into details, but within the maritime industry, there's something called a flag state, and meaning what that means is that a ship always has to come from a certain state where they're registered, and that state then has some sort of enforcement obligation over the ship. Now, previously, there was this phenomenon called the open register states, or basically flags of convenience, where a ship owner could register their ships, and then in return they paid the tax, and then in return the country didn't really enforce anything. That was why they were called flags of convenience. But as the way we see it is that is also on the retreat. More and more countries that are prominent flag states are actually doing what they can to try and live up to the international obligations. Now, of course, it's not perfect, and there are still some examples of things that needs to be better in different places, but it's moving generally slowly in the right direction in that regard. Hope it makes sense.
Yeah, no, most definitely it makes sense, Jesper, and also FAO and Wageningen, with the Center for Research and Innovation, we carried out a study for the agri-food system in particular, of looking at processes that have taken place over a 20-year period, that have specifically looking at sustainability, but more from a broader perspective. And we looked at 3 countries: Costa Rica, Ireland, Rwanda, and we have more countries lined up, but it's exactly as you say, country, depending on the context, depending on where they're coming from, what their priorities are. Some countries were stronger on the environment, other countries, for instance, were stronger on the nutrition, other countries were stronger on efficiency in the value chain, and but there's lots of great innovations happening out there, and you can see a better and closer alignment between the public and private sector, which is excellent. Okay, lastly, I wonder if we can squeeze in, sorry, I should have probably asked this more provocative question first, but the second part to Daniel's question is national and international lobbies and their role in either promoting or hindering. So should have asked that at the beginning, really, because it's, I'm sure a question that a lot of people are thinking, There's a lot of talk about greenwashing, for instance. So can we just have your final thoughts on that, please?
Of course, should I lead out, perhaps? Yeah. lobbying as a term often has a bad ring to it, but the thing is that it can actually also be positive as long as you're upfront and completely transparent and open regarding what your views are. For instance, we are part of different industry organizations who work towards trying to achieve regulatory achievements that are aligned with our train of thought, mainly raising the standards, for instance, within the climate. And that's where we see that the international industry community organizations actually also can prove their worth in terms of pushing states and other organizations towards a common goal. So it can definitely be positive, as long as you're transparent and completely open about what organizations are you part of, what are they doing, what are their goals, etc., etc. Now, that being said, of course, also there can be industry organizations or organizations in general that kind of pushes it in the other direction. So it isn't a clear-cut answer from my side, but organizations can definitely play a positive role towards achieving more climate-friendly regulations and changes, and also subsequently on the enforcement part. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jesper. And Erin, your last thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I don't know that I can speak to the lobbies, but I think there is a lot of movement and excitement about cracking down on greenwashing and about saying one thing, but lobbying for another. So for example, in the focused on the US, a group of CEOs has recently announced some standards and guidelines on this exact thing, so that companies can't say they have one view on climate and certain goals, but then go to Congress and lobby for something different. So really seeking better alignment between talk and walk. And I think there's the UK Green Claims Code. We have a similar legislation in Denmark around truthfulness in advertising. So for example, we're seeing a major automaker being sued in the state of Denmark now for running a billboard saying, this car was produced in a factory with 100% green energy, simply because, while that may be true, it's misleading to think that the car is more sustainable because it's been produced in a green energy factory, when really 95% of the impact of the product of a car is in consumer use and fuel usage. So I do think governments and others, I think, are getting very serious about aligning talk and walk and action and ambition. So I think this is a trend that will continue and hopefully rectify some of these challenges.
Erin, thanks so much. Yeah, and your last comment there just made me think about labeling and food as well. As we all know, that's what is it they call it? Yeah, sometimes food fraud. And issues related to labeling and marketing, and that's something that's also been taken to task by many governments, even though we've got a long way to go. Okay, so that really brings us to the close. We've had a very quiet audience, and yeah, a lot of people, those still on the line listening, and yeah, it was really a fascinating conversation. This area of work is obviously just going to become much more important. It was a niche area of work going back 10 years ago, but obviously as we move towards the crisis that the world is facing, it's an area of work that impinges on all of our lives and all of the sectors that we work in. There's no one sector that cannot escape adopting green growth practices into the work that it's doing. And if there is any sector, or indeed any company, that ignores it, then it does so at its own peril. That's my own personal thought on that. It's now at the moment, as Jesper said, it's you can be a first mover. It can be about competitive advantage. but shortly it will become mainstream practice, and increasingly clients and investors, I know anyway, in the agri-food industry expect it. No, they expect that the products that they buy are sustainably produced, and they yeah, so yeah, without any further ado, then I'd like to extend my thanks again to you, Jasper, and to you, Erin, for taking the time. Really, yes, immense thanks just for sharing those insights so candidly and articulate, in a very articulate way. I'd also like to shout out to the task team that worked with BSR and provided the guidance alongside myself. That was Sylvia Sull from the World Bank, Stefan Felix from GIZ, Anastasia De Santos from USAID, and others. And also the support of the DCED Secretariat. I know Jim is in the background there, and also Ella Duffy for supporting with the editing of the report and all the logistics related to the holding of this webinar. So yeah, so that's it. I hope we have the opportunity to meet and possibly work again together in the future. And yeah, thank you, and have a great rest of the day, rest of the morning, wherever you are in the world. And thanks so much to the audience and the participants.